So, Erik, thank you so much for being a guest on my podcast, Therapy for Guys. I know it's a very last minute thing. I reached out to you, I think, a couple days ago when I found out that you had translated Byung Chul-Han's The Burnout Society from German into English. And I was so excited that you reached back out. And I'm just happy to have this conversation with you. First and foremost, to get to know you better, and then maybe to hopefully discuss the process of translating that incredible work.
Oh, well, the pleasure's all mine. Thanks for getting in touch.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, would you mind just for a brief moment kind of telling the audience a little bit about yourself, what you're up to, a little bit about your scholarship and any other information you'd want to share before we jump into this conversation?
Sure, I'll try to make it brief. I've translated probably some 24 books, both academic titles and works of fiction, mainly from French and German, but on occasion from some related languages too. And along the way, I've written a few books of my own, the most recent of which is called The Devil and His Advocates, which is obviously an examination of a much maligned figure
Yes.
who I argue, really should be given more credit than he receives in a monotheistic framework. I mean, if there's only one God, he necessarily trumps everybody else, and there can't be a counter God contriving evil. So I explore in the Bible and then also a range of literary works how the devil, in a very indirect way, actually supports the famously mysterious ways of the Lord himself. And so
Mm.
he's not a bad guy entirely. Even
I
if
love that. And I want to read the book and maybe have you back on because it seems fascinating.
yeah, well, it was a great pleasure to write, and people do seem to like it. So by all means, I encourage you to take a gander. Anyway, that's the sort of quick and dirty version of who I am and what I've been doing. I also wrote a couple books on vampires way back when. They're kind of another sort of embodiment of evil that unravels into something far more complex than you might think. So I sort of look at European political history and how
Mm.
vampires show up in problem zones where identities are heavily contested, and there's no other way of addressing conflicts more directly. So that's me, the translator and the author of the books on the bad guys who maybe aren't always so bad.
Yeah, I love that. So one of the things that I was curious about is when it comes to, your upbringing, growing up, your childhood, was there a religious kind of background or some type of spirituality? It seems like some of your writing hits on some of those themes, but from a unique perspective. I was curious what kind of led to that.
Yeah, it all came sort of in a very roundabout manner because I would describe my parents as pretty free and loose folks of maybe the Unitarian stripe at
Okay.
most. I mean, just one of these reform religions that has sort of reformed the religion out of the religion. I mean,
Yeah,
no real rules or anything, more just a lot of discussion
sure.
about social issues and problems. So I, without a religious upbringing, I kind of had to discover a few things for myself, but I always did that sort of as an onlooker. I didn't really participate in anybody else's religion either, but I always tried to take respectful notice, when given the opportunity to attend services and listen to people who were discussing things within this framework. So
Sure.
it's it's a secondary sort, but it's not something innate and inborn. It's something acquired after the fact and consciously constructed.
Okay, got you. What did you end up focusing on, like in your undergraduate and graduate studies? What was it connected to this?
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. There was just the signal went out for a minute there, and I'm sorry. Could you repeat?
Yeah, when it comes to like your undergraduate training, what was that in? What was it connecting to some of that stuff, or was it completely different?
Well, no. So I majored in literature, and one of the most sort of formative experiences I had was actually studying ancient Greek
Mm,
um, and Latin. And in the course of that, I learned not only about pagan antiquity, but also the shift from a pagan world to a Judeo-Christian one, or
okay,
not always a shift. They existed alongside each other, and then the relative predominance changed. Um, and at one point, one of the best courses I took involved reading biblical apocrypha, so the third book of the Maccabees, which isn't even in the Hebrew Bible, much less the Christian one, but at the time was a holy text, read by religious communities.
sure,
And even though it was a Jewish text, it was written in Greek and had all of these references to Greek culture. And I found this sort of confusion, which I mean in the best possible way, maybe
yeah,
this commingling or interpenetration of different cultures together, to be something really fascinating. And it's sort of been following that type of the type of questions that I first encountered in that context that have sort of that following those questions has shaped my projects ever since, I'd say.
okay, got you. Wow. So is that kind of the beginnings of your interest in doing, translation work? I was hoping we could get into that, how that started.
Yeah, it really is, insofar as there's no way to study. I mean, basically, what you're doing when you're studying ancient languages is you're spending a lot of time with a dictionary and a grammar
Yeah.
translating. I suppose I developed a set of habits there, and probably masochistic, predilections, that made me a good candidate for, becoming a translator later in life, because it is kind of this weird, solitary, mildly, self-abusive kind of activity. I mean,
Sure.
uh, but that is how it started, I guess. But I had also earlier in life uh, had some preparation for all of this, because, and I maybe should have mentioned this at the outset. I had parents who were in the military and lived in Germany for 3 years,
Oh, got you.
in junior high school and high school, so from the eighth through 10th grades. And during that period, I actually attended German schools,
Mm,
which really, well, either warped my perspective or, made me the unique and wonderful person that I am today.
that's what I'm going with.
Because, thank you.
Okay, so you were in master, or you were in that culture, and so that's definitely a part of your story. I love that.
Oh yeah, and also just this weird sense of being, of just one day not being able to communicate with anyone at all.
Mm,
Um, because, and I also at a period in early adolescence. I mean, by the time you're, 13 or 14, you've started to get your bearings, maybe, however poorly, in your own language
sure.
and culture, but then to be uprooted and put somewhere else uh, can be fairly traumatic, or at least it was in my case. But I mean, you know, it's like working out or something. You when you tear tissue, it grows back stronger,
Mm,
provided that you don't really hurt yourself too badly. And so
sure.
I sort of think of it in those terms. So it took me half a year or so before I was communicating very effectively with anyone at all. But then uh, in about a half a year, I was getting along fine, and from that point on, everything was more detail oriented.
Mm.
So, but still, this experience of being thrust back into infancy
Yeah,
uh,
that's a good way to put it.
at 13 is was profoundly disorienting, and that obviously uh, that whole experience was beneficial in the end for becoming a translator.
Yeah. Oh, I can only imagine. So you're there in Germany for just a few years and then you come back to the States or did
Exactly. For 3 years in Germany, and then back to the United States, but back to a new part of the United States, which is another story. You
okay.
know, I left from Indiana, then was in Germany, and returned to El Paso, Texas. So
Oh
you know,
man.
these it's the change was constant.
Okay.
And
What was
I mean,
in you?
in El Paso, I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna ask, yeah, what was in El Paso?
Well, so again, it's just a military connection.
Okay.
There's a large element of chance in all of this, but El Paso is a fascinating place. Not that I necessarily really appreciated this at the time, but since it is right there on the border, I mean, it is right where Texas ends and New Mexico starts, and it's also where Mexico starts.
Right.
Um,
It's a border
so,
town.
and you can literally walk over the bridge, you know, into another city and into
Mm.
another country. Um, and so again, this experience of being sort of an outsider a couple times over um, was very stimulating, for want of a better word. I'm sure I wouldn't have used that term back then. I probably would have
Right.
said like agonizing, but
Yeah, yeah.
maybe uh, anyway, traumatic or something.
Sure.
But it was really stimulating to be yeah, as I said, an outsider a couple times over, repeatedly. And
Right.
that's something that a translator winds up being, you know, when they sit down to translate something too. You're an outsider, it's somebody else's book, and you're just kind of, you know, you've been given the keys to root around in it maybe, but it doesn't belong to you. And you there's this constant interplay between respecting the original and what's there, and then taking the liberties you have to make it your own, or to turn it into something that is will be understandable to people in another language.
Oh man, that's such a great point. I hadn't thought about that, but you are kind of navigating a lot of different realities. And I can only imagine that you're also entering a situation where there's going to be a bunch of people that are not very happy with some of the decisions that you make.
Oh yeah, like in translation.
Yes.
Oh yeah, yeah, no, yes, that is almost guaranteed. It's just that it's never guaranteed where it's going to come from.
Okay.
Because you know, sometimes, very often, you'll have authors who, you know, rightly feel that you know, the book is theirs, but they don't, and they'll often know English. This is something I've encountered a lot with people from Germany.
Okay.
They'll know English well, but they won't have any kind of native sense of style. So
Mm.
therefore, they are wanting that everything be translated like it is written by them in the original. So when
Oh,
so like with that atrocious sentence I just produced, you know,
sure.
would be a faithful translation of something from German, which uses a lot more of these passive constructions and has these
Mm.
long, never-ending sentences and so on and so forth. But yeah, in English, in contrast, you want to be direct. You want to, you know, have active verbs. You want to put the action front and center. And so, you know, that isn't something that is necessarily really people aren't even necessarily aware of that.
Right.
And so they can just be like, what's happened to my book? It's been turned into something totally
Yeah,
different.
you've taken my baby and you've changed it.
Yeah, yeah. So that kind of thing can happen. For example, but any number of other things as well, because ultimately, you know, it's not just you and the author. There's this whole publishing network in between, and editors can be both, you know, a godsend and a real plague, depending on
Oh,
you know, what they think is right. I've had really great experiences with people who really understand their role very well, and then some not so great experiences when they've kind of seen it as incumbent on them to step in
Oh,
and steer
got
a
you.
translation. You know.
I wondered what some of the negative experiences would look like, them maybe overstepping their bounds or taking too much control over where it should go.
Yeah, it's just for example, if I've had so one situation that's fairly common is if you do a translation that is a strong translation, that is to say, it doesn't just reproduce the syntax of the original. It's something that makes it sound like it's been written in English. So it's a
Sure.
forceful translation in that sense. And the author say has some reservations about it for the aforementioned reasons. If the editor in a situation like that doesn't at least explain your rationale or the reasons why somebody might take the strong assertive approach to translation, there you can there instead of sort of building a bridge, they can work to the further detriment of already bad communication.
Got you.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
Wow, man. That
Anyway,
seems just like a lot to navigate.
yeah. I'm sure it's it's probably like everything that you hear, or whenever people are on these entertainment shows and they're talking about music or movies or something and all the things that can go wrong there.
Oh
This is
yeah.
like a much less glamorous version of that.
Okay. A lot of moving
You know,
parts.
the studio steps in and it's like, we're not going to have this ending, or we're not going to have this person starring.
I like that a lot less glamorous version of that. So how do you end up something? It's great that you kind of shared some of the pieces growing up that kind of contributed to you becoming a translator. What was it like, or what was the story behind actually doing it professionally in some ways for a living? How did that happen?
Well, it happened. I was formerly in an academic position, but it
Okay,
was becoming, at a university as a professor, but it was becoming more and more difficult to do the kind of thing that I was interested in. And that's a
got you.
whole different story. But I mean, you can open up any trade journal in the academic world, and there will be all of these horror stories about the kind of stuff happening in universities these days. I have just in terms of freedom of speech issues and helicopter parenting and students with these kind of morbid sensitivity to like really anything that might take them out of their comfort zone, and so on and so forth.
Can I make a
Anyway,
quick connection over there? Just
sure.
there's this show that my wife and I are watching. It's actually a therapy show. It's brand new on Apple TV Plus, and it's called Shrinking. And one of the characters is actually Harrison Ford, who's 80 now, and he is speaking to one of his colleagues who wants to go into academia as a professor. And he says, "You don't want to do that. Academia is like," and I think he's referring to Dante's Seven Layers of Hell. He's like, there, it's at the very bottom. Why would you ever want to
Yeah,
do
it really.
that?
I'll keep an eye peeled for that. Although, yeah, intuitively that makes sense, and I think that just about anybody in the profession, well, past or present, will agree with that assessment. So there I was, and but there I was, and I was looking for some kind of way out, but I was also looking to get to invigorate my own scholarship with the most interesting material I could find.
Okay.
And in that context, I found a book by a Yiddish author um, that I translated, and I translated it not because I have any great background in Yiddish or any particular qualifications other than knowing the Hebrew alphabet and some Slavic languages
Sure.
and German. But I was fascinated by this book, and nobody had translated it before, so I figured it might as well be me.
Mm.
And that was actually my first step into the world of professional translating, which was really probably the most extreme thing I could have done. Not that I realized it at the time, because
Sure.
instead of taking something that was short, manageable, and in a language I knew, I took something that was long, extremely controversial, and in a language that I could read well, but was by no means an expert in.
Got you.
But that said, once I'd actually done this whole book in Yiddish and it was translated and it was published and it got good reviews and so forth, I mean, from that point on, everything else has been relatively easy,
Okay.
uh, because that was really the trial by fire.
I was going to say that seems to be kind of a theme in your life, going through these difficult situations and circumstances, but somehow coming out stronger and growing through them.
Well, yeah, no, you're the therapist. What you don't see is how it utterly saps and undermines my sense of well-being internally, and how, in
Got
fact,
you.
I'm a far more damaged person than I might seem to be on
Mm.
the outside. But no, just a bad joke. I'm always strengthened by adversity.
Yeah, no, one of my quotes that you can't see, if I could move my computer I'd show you, but on my wall is Marcus Aurelius's "The obstacle is the way." I've always kind of come back to that as something that's in line with what we've been talking about, going through the difficulties and kind of coming out stronger.
Well, yeah, there's certainly that is certainly something that I never chose to do at first, but then I never chose to do. I don't really have the feeling that it seems that it's something that's happened sort of unconsciously ever since.
Sure.
You know, at first
Yeah.
getting stuck in the German school, but then everything afterwards, it's like I didn't know that I was just, and intuitively I didn't go and say, like, I want the hardest thing to translate to prove myself in,
Sure.
but
Sure.
unconsciously I sort of went in that direction.
Yeah. Now, can you speak to, with all the things that you've translated, how after that one you just talked about, how you end up choosing which book you're going to translate? I mean, do you get a lot of say in that, or does a publisher kind of come to you? I'm just curious, kind of how it works.
Yeah, it I've had experience sort of both ways.
Okay.
By and large, I would say that the publisher, sorry, comes to you or me
Okay.
in this case. Um, but through some of the translations that I've done for I have come into contact with other people in presses to whom I could propose projects on my own. So initially, it was presses coming to me and saying, "Oh, we have this book," and this is one of these things I was talking about earlier when I was talking about the sort of diminishing returns of the academic world. It's
Yes.
all much more business-like than you might expect. It's like, well, we
Okay.
have options on this book and we need it translated by X date, because it's going to have a print run of whatever, and we have a budget of X, and this is going to be supported by a grant from Y. I mean,
Mm.
it's gone are the days when, I don't know, a bunch of intellectual types sat around a table and read through manuscripts, and on that basis decided, what they happen to like and would share with the world. This
Got
is
you.
all much more sort of a world of committee work and bureaucracy. But the for the most part, I've been approached by presses, but then through some of the contacts I've made, as I said, I've been able to propose projects, and that's how I wound up doing all of the titles. If you look on my website for Wakefield Press,
Okay.
which those are literary translations, and those are by and large projects that are much closer to my heart, or on average, they will be much closer to sort of my heart than a lot of the academic titles, which can range from stuff that I really, really like to some other titles that are a bit more mercenary. And it's just like,
Okay.
well, I mean, they say they need it. I need to make some money,
You got to
so
pay the bills, right?
I've got to pay the bills. So here's a book on, whatever, and it's not necessarily something that I'm that drawn to.
Sure, sure. Now, I know in initially connecting with you, I found out about you because I had kind of finished this one book by Byung Chul-Han. I hope I'm saying his name right. I always feel like I'm butchering it, but I don't know if you know how to pronounce it correctly.
Well, it's all actually you want somebody who has he actually probably would tell much the same story about being an outsider a few times over because he's from
Mm,
Korea and writes in German. Um,
yeah,
so
I
now,
read
now
that.
that's that's an even more radical jump than
Mm,
North America to Europe. But anyway, but as for the proper pronunciation and everything, I don't know that I can speak with any authority on that.
okay,
I just say in Germany at least, that people just say Byung Chul Han,
okay.
and
Byung Chul-Han. Okay.
but
I
that
hadn't
that
heard
doesn't
that
mean
yet,
that
but
you're
I
right.
that sounds right. Byung Chul-Han.
Um,
So
it,
how did you get linked up with? I don't know if you got a chance to talk to him or how that worked. I'm just curious if you could kind of whatever you're able to share, kind of talk about how that started and the whole process of translating the Burnout Society because it's just a really important book to me.
yeah, well, I haven't actually had that much contact with the author himself. Just exchanged a few emails. I mean,
Okay.
as anyone who reads his books will quickly gather, he's somewhat reclusive and has a very sort of skeptical view of the
Yes.
world of technology and mass
Yes.
communication and everything being available at once. He's really uh, hands off in that regard. But I came into contact with his work. I hadn't known it previously, but one of the people whose works I had who by well one person I translated a book by drew him to my attention,
Hmm.
and as a sort of rise in not star in Germany, but as somebody who was, starting to get a lot of attention,
Sure.
both within the academic world and more broadly. And so at that time, thanks to an editor at Stanford University Press, this individual with whom I had spoken, who had some weight to throw around since he was a big muckety muck
Yeah.
in the academic world, uh, he thanks to his intervention, the Stanford University Press got interested in translating a couple things by Byung-Chul Han, and I was just either well, nobody ever told me if like they were dead set on having me as the best guy for the job or if I just happened to be around,
Okay.
but but that's how I wound up with the job. And I mean, I do think that it's because I had done a good job with this other person's book that I was first in line for the new project too.
Got you.
But that's kind of how it first materialized.
Okay. So did you have before that much of an interest in philosophy or even just some of the ideas that Chul-Han gets into in the book?
Yeah, I definitely I've always had a great interest in philosophy, in
Okay.
fact. So in a and I also I also, besides my undergraduate degree, I have a degree in a PhD in comparative literature,
Oh, wow.
which at least in its day, well, we're really talking about the 90s here,
Okay.
but basically from the 70s to the 90s, it had the reputation for being a sort of philosophical branch of literary study.
Oh, okay.
Um, that just within the sort of within the universe that emerged within the American institutions of higher learning. So I, at any rate, had read a lot of philosophy in a sort of semi-professional capacity, while pursuing this degree.
Sure.
So it was a really good fit in that regard. Plus, I have to say, one thing that drew me to the books right away was the it's just how unusually direct they were for books of philosophy.
Mm,
Instead of this sort of pondering imponderables and these interminable sentences, which you know which are familiar in philosophy everywhere, but especially in German philosophy. I mean, you can have paragraphs that go on for
oh yeah.
pages. Um, but I really loved Byung Chul-Han's directness and sort of unconventional approach to the subject matter, and
Sure.
that was a big draw as well.
Sure. Oh man. Okay. So I definitely wanted to ask some questions about that, kind of the style or the form. But before that, I'm just curious, going back to your PhD program, who were some of the thinkers or some of the philosophers that y'all were, engaging with in the 90s?
Oh well, there were all of the heroes of yesteryear. I don't know if they still are today, because again, the whole nature of the academic enterprise seems to be changing. But back then, the big names were they were mainly French, although all the French uh, authors were heavily indebted to German predecessors. But Roland Barthes,
Mm,
Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Jacques Lacan. My personal favorite was somebody who wasn't discussed that much because he's such an odd man out, but René Girard. I don't
oh
know if you've heard
yeah.
of him, but
I'm
he
actually after this, I'm interviewing someone who's written kind of a theology book, but the first section of the book is engaging some of his mimetic theory. Um, but please, can you
oh,
speak to what drew you to Girard and his thinking?
well, what I liked most about him is how he managed to combine things that seem to be worlds apart. I mean,
Mm,
here's somebody would uh, who would talk about mimetic theory. So that is how eh, uh, you know plants, animals, and people copy each other,
right.
basically. So he would be he'd uh, go from discussing primate research or something that happens, in a very specific corner of the world that seems miles away from theology. And
Mm,
then uh, within a few breaths, he'd managed to relate this to a certain interpretation of parts of the Bible.
mm,
Um, and that breadth, I think, more than anything, really, that breadth of vision really amazed me, and impressed me. And specifically, his idea of how mimetic conflict is resolved through violence.
mm.
That is something that was a really important idea when I was working on the vampire material, because
Okay.
what you have there is a situation where the entire social body is in a diseased state.
Mm,
Nobody knows who anybody else is and what they are. The dead aren't staying dead. The people who should be familiar are acting like foreigners.
mm,
That kind of thing. So there's this mimetic crisis, Girard would say, that then magically gets resolved when everybody bands together and ritually exterminates a supposed the supposed source of all the trouble,
mm.
which is this body that supposedly has been getting up from the grave and going around and bothering people.
Right. Oh, that's so
Um,
good.
so anyway, that lots of guys, but Girard chief among them, and I'm sure your next guest will have a lot more to say about it. And he's really a very interesting thinker, I think.
Yeah. I'm just curious. Do you feel like Gerard is someone that could speak to even some of the things that we struggle with in our contemporary culture?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think far more than a lot of his contemporaries. And he also, unlike a lot of, I mean, he also wound up spending most of his life in the United States.
Okay. Was he at Stanford?
Yeah, he wound up
Okay.
at Stanford. So he was, and he so again, he's another perfect example of the outsider as insider, or somebody who has an outsider perspective, because he was an accredited, respected, member of his field in the American academic system, but he really was. But he came from abroad, and he, to the end of his life, he had this very foreign sensibility, which,
Mm.
however, he brought to bear on things here in new and exciting ways. So I know that at the towards the end of his life, he started talking a bit more, or maybe this is something that actually had begun earlier, but I became aware of him talking about sort of behavioral issues, stuff like
Mm.
anorexia and all of these things that really are viewed as belonging to the sort of realm of psychology and the behavioral sciences. He started
Yes.
talking about these things in terms of his larger mimetic theory. So anyway, long story short, I'm sure he's got something to say about probably every aspect of the world we live in right now.
Okay. Oh, that's great. That's great. Okay. Oh man, I'm glad we took that detour. So that's great. So but going back to Chul-Han, you know, in terms of the form of that book, or just his style, could you say any more about it? And maybe the little note I'll make is I've heard people connect it maybe even to his Zen Buddhism. There's like this poetic aspect to it, or sometimes it seems more like a work of art than a work of philosophy. I wonder if you could tease some of that out.
Well, I wonder if I can too. I mean, because that actually hadn't occurred to me. I mean, I do agree. It makes intuitive sense, when to hear you say it. I understand immediately what you mean. But I had always thought of him more in terms of Western medieval philosophical tradition. So,
Okay.
like, Aquinas or somebody like that, somebody who's going to put out a thesis and then debate it point for point.
Mm,
He has this very methodical, so that doesn't preclude a spiritual dimension, and it doesn't
okay.
preclude artistry in what he's doing. But this, there is something sort of scholastic in again, in the medieval sense of the word,
Sure.
where in the way that he just kind of hammers things out in a very business-like manner, as it were. Business sounds unfortunate because that's one of the things that he tends not to like at all, business. But matter of fact, I guess
Sure,
he
sure.
hammers things out in a matter of fact a manner. And that's also probably got something to do with the fact that German isn't his native language at all. I mean, I know from my own experience that when you're writing in a foreign tongue, you really there's no way that you can BS. There's
Oh,
no
it's
way
so
that you
true.
can, and even not BS. There's also no way that you can kind of achieve some of the stylistic, kind of polish
Sure.
that you can in your native tongue. So all of this uh, has led him, I think, to make a very sort of distilled, uh, yeah, very distilled and concentrated form of writing, because his books are also very short
Yeah,
and
I wondered
and
about that.
to the point.
Do you have a thought as to why they're, because he's written so much, and it's not that he has a lack of words or insight, but I wonder if that's purposeful, how they're like these longer essays almost.
Yeah, it's got to be. There is one German precedent for that, and it's one that I know is definitely important for him, and that's Nietzsche, who
Okay.
also wrote lots of short books with in a very punchy epigrammatic style. One of the phrases he used to describe that was the telegram style.
Okay.
It's just like bulletins from the front or something.
Yeah.
Um, so there's probably a combination of his background in in a larger philosophical tradition that I do think goes back to the Middle Ages with this kind of
Okay.
scholastic debate. Um, the fact that he is a foreigner writing in a foreign language, and then some of the more modern parts of his philosophical diet, like Nietzsche, I think all of that contributes to this very clipped and direct, sort of terse mode of discourse.
Okay. Oh, that's super insightful. I'm so grateful that you're framing it that way. That really helps me. Now, in terms of the actual book, when you were translating it and just, I'm assuming, just kind of internalizing it and digesting it, what were some of the ideas or some of the things in there that just struck you, that got you thinking, maybe have stayed with you? What was it, a meaningful book for you?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, he also tends to circle around the same themes over and over again. So I hope that I actually do justice to the work that you have in mind, and I'm not running it together with, because I've translated probably 5 books of his.
Oh, I didn't
Uh,
realize that. Okay.
yeah. At any rate,
That's fucking awesome, man.
well, it's again, they're mercifully short, and again, he does sort of have his well, I mean, I don't mean this disparagingly, but he does have his hobby horses, things that he
Oh yeah.
returns
No,
to
no, no,
again.
sure.
Um, but one of the things that stuck with me most is, of course, this whole idea of an achievement society,
Yes.
and because that seems very American in particular, very Protestant,
Mm.
very capitalist. I mean, all of these
Oh
things that
yeah.
and that are connected to other things, but that he seems to really just have this deep-seated cultural sort of and intellectual aversion to.
Sure.
This idea of always being on, I mean, and of always trying to outdo oneself, and also the kind of interior life that constructs, because you're not just you're in an achievement society, you're not just in competition with everybody else who's out to get as much as they can too. You're actually you're really, most importantly, in competition with yourself.
Yes.
I mean, and or a sort of phantom version of yourself that you
Mm.
can never quite uh, live up to, and that
Sure.
can turn against you and kind of become a persecutor. So that idea was one that really stuck with me a lot. But there's others too, of
Yeah,
course.
and I think about, I guess the way you translated it, that auto exploitation, and he talks about in an achievement society, the whole master slave dialectic becomes this thing where you yourself are both master and slave, and you're working against yourself. I just thought, even from a therapeutic background, that's super insightful and helpful and very telling of where we're at in our society.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's, I mean, the one of the neat things about his books is that you can read them on their own terms and for their sort of philosophical depth, and you can also turn on the TV and sort of
Yeah,
see a confirmation of exactly what he's talking about. I
they
mean,
ring true. That's such a good point. I couldn't agree
I mean,
more.
yeah, yeah. Not that the world really needs anybody to watch more of the Kardashians or
Oh,
anything.
geez, please, no.
But that's kind of is an illustration of this
Absolutely.
of constantly trying to mine a paradoxically empty self
Yes.
in in perpetuity. Um, anyway.
So I want to know from you what you think about his whole notion of, in this achievement society, an age of hyper attention, almost the return back to a profound boredom. Because I just think that's so counterintuitive. I've joked on the podcast, gosh, I can so fall into the achievement mindset. I hate being bored, but I know that it's something I need to kind of like enter into, to linger, as he says. What do you think about this concept of profound boredom?
Well, I too find it counterintuitive. I mean, as a North American, and it's and difficult, but at the same time very appealing.
Yes.
Um, because I know what he's talking about, even if I'm not really by nature on that wavelength much myself. This idea of actually just allowing things to materialize and take their own time, and
Mm,
this sort of self-surrender that implies seems very important, because if you're constantly engaged in auto exploitation, as he puts it, I mean, it doesn't take long for you to run out of material. I mean, and there you are, spinning all the wheels, but really producing nothing, but producing nothing for all intents and purposes.
right,
So
right.
this taking time, and I'd have to reread it, but I think he's got one thing that he does very well, and this is a feature of German language philosophy
Okay.
in general. But one thing he does a really good job at is sort of exploring the resonance of different words, because
Mm,
German has a sort of shortage of abstract words.
okay.
It's always the same word that is used for something very concrete will be used for something more rarefied and abstract. So he likes to engage in these kind of etymological games where he talks about the different components that make up words, and which will turn, so the word for boredom, for example, is literally, it breaks into a long while. So
Oh
a long
man.
so and then if you start looking at it as a long while, it's not
Oh,
boredom at all. There are some things that we want to last forever. you know
yes.
now they aren't referred to as a long while in German either, but by going, just by peeling back one layer of the
Mm,
language, he'll find a totally different set of resonances in a word. And um and so and that actually makes the book itself an illustration of what he's talking about, because these aren't books that you pick up and read quickly the way you would read an instruction manual.
right.
You're supposed to linger and like, maybe just read a page at a time, and if it's doing its job, it will, make you think,
Yes.
and you'll have to put it down, and
Mm,
you'll have to take a long while to get through just a 50-page book, because something more profound than boredom is happening, that is like
mm.
boredom, but not. It's a totally different time with a totally different kind of complexion.
Wow. Oh, it's so good. Do you think that creativity emerges out of that long while, that boredom?
I think I certainly couldn't speak. I think there's creativity of all kinds, different kinds, and it works different ways for different people. But I think certainly some of the most profound work has come from people who lose themselves in a situation and then find new aspects of reality, precisely because they're stuck looking at something for such a long period of time.
Mm,
I mean, it's if you look at a really good, even like nature photography or something, it's
sure.
always about capturing it's not about what happens fast. It's about stopping and lingering and seeing how a bug has actually crawled, a tiny little creature has crawled, up a flower stem or something,
Mm,
and at a certain hour of the day the light just catches it in a certain way, so that it has this diaphanous wing, and that's like a stained glass window or something like that.
sure.
I mean, so there, I do think that one of the well springs for creativity, yeah, definitely has to be, at least from shuffling the sense of time a lot. It doesn't always have to become a long while. Maybe it can be a short while. It can become compressed and too,
Sure.
but it has to become something plastic that's molded in different ways.
Okay. Yeah, that's well said. So, Eric, one of the things that I feel like Chul-Han laments in the book is that in the achievement society, we've kind of reduced human existence to, I think he calls it health culture, or just kind of bare life, the vital functions of our existence. And we don't pursue like the good life. And I'm just curious if you could speak to that. I mean, your own personal thoughts, or what you think he would articulate in terms of what the good life is and how we should think about that.
Well, I think just I hope I'm answering this. There's not just the good life, there's also the contemplative life, there's the active life, there's all kinds of life that isn't bare life.
Okay.
So I think you know, famously people and philosophers, want the good life both in a moral sense and in an aesthetic one. But there's a value that I think Byung Chul-Han affirms of just any kind of life that isn't just a matter of always being plugged in and turned on and in overdrive. And that's I don't know if he would say that that's the good life per se, but it is. I guess bare life is life that is barely life too.
Right, right.
And at least you're having a
Yeah.
fuller experience if you are taking some distance from this achievement society kind of mindset.
Yeah, yeah. Now, since you, I think, know some of this stuff really well in terms of, even medieval thought, and maybe even, certain types of Christian mysticism. I know that, like in the Catholic tradition, when the concept of contemplation is talked about, it's usually in relationship to, a divine being, the Holy Trinity, whatever it might be. For Chul-Han, do you have a sense of what contemplation is being referred to? Like, is there some type of divinity there, or is it just communing with life? I mean, how do you think he thinks about that?
Well, I do think that he actually has some kind of background specifically in Catholic theology. I could be
Okay.
wrong about that.
I read that he did, but I don't know
Okay,
much
well,
about
there
that.
you go. Then okay, then he definitely does. Or well, or we're both getting
We're
stuff from
both
the
wrong.
same
Yeah.
source. But okay, but even more directly, I think he gets a lot of his ideas about contemplation from Martin Heidegger,
Okay.
the who was a Catholic philosopher, but the Catholic isn't sort of a decisive factor.
Sure.
That was more just his upbringing, and he's and he's the big philosopher of being,
Mm,
who would write a lengthy essay just on a pair of shoes or a clod of
mm.
dirt or something that just is there and what it means for it to be there. So that is definitely contemplation. I think is a way of getting. It's both a way of elevating yourself to something divine, but
Mm.
more importantly, perhaps it's not trying to project your head above the clouds to see God, as it were. It's more about finding how the divine has shaped everything down here in the world that seems so unremarkable at first glance.
Got you.
I, I
So,
I think so. The contemplation is really about rediscovering the sort of seeds of the divine, or what's the treasure that's been scattered in the world, as opposed to having a mystic experience of self loss.
mm, that really resonates with me, and I could see that sort of coming out in his book. Sure. Now, in terms of just words and your work in translation with, the Burnout Society, and, any other book that you've done from him, are there any other kind of German words that are packed with meaning, like when you just unpacked the whole idea of boredom as, staying with?
Yeah, I'm picking up a book right here just to see if there's anything um, that catches my eye, because
Sure.
there's oh well, here's so I was just talking about Heidegger, And here in this book called In the Swarm, which
Okay,
is
I just bought that.
okay, it's good too. They're all good. They're all good. But here's a fun sentence, and this is a quote from Heidegger, but this is the type of thing that Byung Chul-Han does too. So he says, Die Hand handelt. So the hand handles,
Mm,
but handeln in German also means to act. So the hand plays a role in shaping reality. Die Hand handelt.
mm.
Like Handlung is also the word for a plot in a play.
Oh, wow.
It's there. He'll start riffing on, and you can't do that kind of thing that well in English,
No.
because it's, I don't know, it's like too much. Well, the whole history of the language's evolution is obviously different from German, um, but there are lots of times when he picks up on a word that just seems everyday, like what could be a more commonplace word than hand and to act. The hand
Sure.
acts. I mean, that sounds so, that, you know, the brain thinks, the hand acts. That sounds like nothing, but then by exploring the etymology and
Mm,
the resonances of each word, when the hand handles, you start moving into another territory. And again, that is also, and then something that doesn't sound intellectual at all winds up being actually very contemplative, because the hand handling is handling the matter, then finding the sort of the pearls and jewels of the divine that have been left behind here in the earth, that we just in the muck and mire that we normally just walk right on by.
yeah,
Um, so that was one example.
that is so
Um,
good.
there's a lot of others though. Um, it's just oh, he also does a great thing on modal verbs,
Okay.
which is something that probably doesn't mean much to most people
I
except
can't say
linguists.
that it does. Maybe you could explain that.
So modal verbs are verbs of necessity and obligation, like would, should,
Mm,
could, ought, uh, things like that. So
sure.
he's got the here, and actually in the Burnout Society, now that I'm looking at it, he 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 discusses the but elsewhere as well, as I recall, he talks about the fact that these verbs are expressions of power and potential. They're not, it's all about trying to circumscribe something that could have a force in the world, but doesn't yet, and doesn't
Mm,
necessarily ever go into fulfillment. And this sort of, again, this relates, as I see it, to what I was talking about earlier about sort of peeling away a first level of appearances and finding something deeper in something very common. So just like boredom, long while, the hand handles, you know, well, I should do that. What does it really mean to say they should? Because that's this floating state that
right.
exists. It's not something that is given, that has happened yet. And where does this should come from? Is it a voice from within, or is it an imperative that comes from a higher source that's divine, for example? Or is it another kind of exteriority, like a social obligation? At any rate, he's always trying to bring the most commonplace and everyday aspects of reality into circulation, and to show the sort of philosophical depth to our everyday experience.
Sure. And okay, so building on that a little bit, one of the things I think he distinguishes in the book, The Burnout Society, in moving from Foucault's disciplinary society, there's maybe the modal verb, if I'm saying that right, of should or must, to in the achievement society, there's the modal verb you can. Do you see that as a big distinction, as an important distinction from your
Well,
perspective as a
what
linguist?
I think is important is how one contains the other. Like the you can actually is a sneaky way of saying you must in the
Mm,
achievement society. It's like, because you can be more, you must be more.
mm.
So in other words, you have to be all that you can be in order to be yourself in the first place. Is would sort of be the irony of that.
Got you. And I think he even mentions, but we're still caught in the illusion that in this achievement society mode, that because it's the can now, there's maybe a sense of freedom, but maybe it's not a sense of freedom. Maybe it's still the should and the must.
Yeah, yeah, I think he would definitely say something to the effect of how one verb winds up sort of stealthily taking the place of the other,
Okay.
because can definitely makes it sound like it's up to you and you have choice and agency and so on and so forth. But if at the same time uh, it's a matter of obligation that you do this, then the can has a very different resonance and might better be translated by a different word altogether.
Okay. Great. Yeah. Man, Erik, I know that I have to jump off in just a minute, but this has been tremendous. Thank you so much for spending the time and talking about your own story and how you got into translating and then answering my questions about Chul-Han. I just really appreciate it. And I'll include your website in the show notes and everything. And yeah, I usually like to ask the guests at the very end to just end with what's the line of the podcast by just saying continue the conversation. Would you mind saying that?
No, no, by all means, get the book, read the book, and continue the conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you.